It's fast, it's sleek, and it no longer represents the future. However, it still has its place in society today. What you see here is the Mark 7 monorail, the latest generation of monorail at Walt Disney's original Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Opened in 1959, it is the first daily operating monorail system in the Western Hemisphere. Walt Disney was a big fan of public transit. Disneyland opened with streetcars on Main Street, a paddle wheeler on the river, a rocket to the moon, a futuristic freeway, and even the park itself was surrounded by a railroad. Early concept art for Tomorrowland showed various types of monorails, but due to budget cuts and monorail technology that wasn't up to Walt's standards, it became a neglected project. But soon after opening, Walt wanted to fix the problematic Tomorrowland. It was underwhelming and not futuristic enough. So once again, he turned his attention to transit, trying to think ahead about how people would get around in the future. The team in charge of developing the attraction decided on a futuristic-looking high-speed train, and Imagineer Bob Gurr was tasked with designing it. He drew inspiration from the 1955 Aero train, built by General Motors. What he came up with was a roughly 1/4 scale version of the Aero train, and it ran on 30-inch narrow-gauge tracks. The train consisted of a 5,000-pound locomotive pulling 5 articulated open-air passenger coaches. The locomotive was powered by an Oldsmobile Rocket V8 engine. The locomotive's cab had its windshield, side doors, and console controls taken from a 1954 Oldsmobile 88 coupe, and a single train had a capacity of 32 occupants. The new attraction was dubbed the Viewliner, and it wasn't just a Tomorrowland attraction. Actually, it transported guests to and from Fantasyland. There were 2 trains. The Tomorrowland Viewliner train was orange, and its cars were named after planets, while the Fantasyland Viewliner train was blue and had its cars named after Disney characters. The Viewliner opened June 10, 1957, and was touted as the fastest miniature train in the world. Which was probably true, seeing as the trains reached a top speed of 30 miles per hour. You see, the trains were equipped with a speedometer that was calibrated to the scale of the train, which again was only 1/4 of real size. This meant that when the train reached 30 miles per hour, the speedometer registered it as 120 miles per hour. What's amazing about the Viewliner was that, in a way, it actually was futuristic. Some of the curves in the track were banked, and the center of gravity on the train was low to the ground, allowing it to safely navigate curves at speed. The cars on the train were permanently coupled together with a single bogie between them, reducing rolling friction, which on a larger scale would significantly increase efficiency. And as a safety feature, the route was divided into blocks, just like a real railroad. If the Viewliner passed a red block signal, the train would automatically apply the brakes. The Viewliner weaved around the Autopias and glided over the canals of the motorboat cruise, creating a layering effect that really pleased Walt. He enjoyed watching the Viewliner speeding just a few feet from the Disneyland Railroad, admiring the contrast between the railroad of the past and the railroad of the future. The Tomorrowland Viewliner station looked similar to the Tomorrowland Depot of the Disneyland Railroad, except the Viewliner station had a lower roof height and was slightly shorter in length. The 2 stations existed at the same time for about 5 months during the year 1958, but when September came around, the Viewliner passed into Disneyland history forever. And the reason for this departure is where the Disneyland Monorail comes into the story. And here is the generally accepted version of its origins. In early 1958, Walt Disney and his wife Lillian were driving down a road in Cologne, Germany. They passed by a concrete beam suspended in the air, and gliding gracefully over it was a monorail. Walt stopped the car and peered out the window as it sped away. He drove onto the test facility and managed to convince the engineers to let him and his wife ride aboard. Lillian Disney was usually skittish about climbing aboard a monorail, because up until then, monorails were traditionally suspended from a rail, which meant they usually swayed and rattled as they traveled down the track. However, Lily could see that the design that ALWEG created was very sturdy. Bumps were dampened well by the rubber tires and suspension system, and lastly, the monorail was relatively quiet. With his wife won over, Walt then sent Admiral Joe Fowler and Roger Broggie to Germany to speak with the ALWEG company to see if their monorail system could be used at Disneyland. Ultimately, the answer was a definite yes. The plan was for Bob Gurr to design the look of the Disneyland Monorails, and ALWEG would manufacture the vehicles and the beamway. Walt wanted the monorail ready in time for the unveiling of his Tomorrowland expansion in 1959, but ALWEG insisted that it wouldn't be feasible because they would have to ship the two monorails and their beams by ocean freight, and it would have to pass through the Panama Canal. When company officials came to see the future location of their monorail at Disneyland, they saw the Viewliner in operation. They asked about the little train, and Walt explained that it was constructed entirely at his studio in Burbank. The officials of ALWEG said that if Imagineers could build the Viewliner, then they could easily construct the monorail trains themselves. Bob Gurr's monorail designs were a cross between the Viewliner design and the rocket of the fictional character Buck Rogers. The Imagineers working on the monorail's route through Tomorrowland really wanted to thrill guests by having it dip, tilt, climb, and weave through the landscape. When consultants from ALWEG saw the first renderings of the track layout, they didn't like it. They wanted the track to be as level as possible with as many straightaways as possible, so that passengers on board could admire its speed. Walt himself was in favor of the twisting and winding route, explaining to the consultants that with the limited space available and nothing but straight and level track, the trip on the monorail would be too short for his guests, especially if it were traveling at high speeds. He did, however, instruct the designer to include a few more straight sections in the track. The compromise they came up with is what we see above Autopia to this very day. When the ALWEG consultants reviewed Bob Gurr's vehicle design, they didn't like it either. They felt that the appearance leaned too closely to science fiction, and they wanted the monorails to be dignified so people would take the system seriously. Well, Walt managed to convince the company officials that the design was fine the way it was. The Disneyland ALWEG monorail system opened alongside the Matterhorn bobsleds and the submarine voyage through liquid space on June 14, 1959, complete with its tight curves and winding beamway, and it dazzled people with its futuristic tail fin design and cockpit bubble. Bob Gurr recalled that the monorails were installed on the tracks less than a week before the grand opening of the park expansion. They had nothing but problems. The electric motors constantly overheated, stranding the monorail above Tomorrowland. Once in a while, the motors would overheat so badly they actually caught fire. It became so frequent that during testing, he and other Imagineers had to have fire extinguishers ready and in hand. Bob Gurr admitted that it wasn't until the night before the grand opening of the ride that he was finally able to take the monorail for a full round trip without it catching fire. And on the next day, Vice President Richard Nixon and his family stood with Walt Disney to cut the ribbon for the ride. Bob drove the monorail up to the station for the ribbon cutting, and Walt invited Nixon and his family into the cockpit for what was supposed to be a quick photo opportunity. Once everyone was seated, Walt surprised Bob when he said, "All right, Gurr, let's go." Well, you don't argue with Walt, so Bob pushed the throttle and the monorail started gliding out of the station. Sweat was beading up on his forehead as he hoped the monorail wouldn't catch fire with Walt Disney and the Vice President on board. Luckily, the monorail made it back without a hitch, but as Bob brought the monorail around the Matterhorn, he saw Secret Service agents below running to catch up with the train. Bob realized he had effectively kidnapped the Vice President. There were only two Mark I monorails, and they were identified by color, one red and one blue. Each monorail had 3 open-air cars, and they ran on a total beam length of nearly a mile. Back then, the monorail was simply a ride. It only traveled over Tomorrowland before returning to the station. They were propelled by 6 300-volt DC motors connected by 2 conductors sliding against the bus bar on the beam. The driving motors each provided 50 horsepower as the monorail climbed grades up to 7% and navigated banked turns that were super elevated up to 8.5 degrees, which is only half the amount of banking that the monorail is capable of. The maximum speed of these monorails was designated at 20 miles per hour, but their motors were capable of 45. The entire monorail track was split into 104 precast beams supported by 104 precast concrete pylon supports. Each beam had a maximum span of 40 feet, and the tightest curve on the whole route was 120-foot radius. And I wouldn't worry about the strength of the beams. A special mixture of super strength concrete was tested on a full-scale beam and recorded a minimum compressive strength of 5,000 pounds per square inch. Concrete is stronger when compressed than it is when forces are pulling it apart, which is why the monorail beam and its pylons were over-engineered. Not only was the concrete cast into a cage of welded rebar, but then the beams were given tension so that they were always in a state of compression, counteracting the forces trying to pull them apart. They even tested a 35-foot curved beam with static weight, representing the maximum load it would ever see in operation. It took 3.5 times the amount of weight before the beam ever showed signs of stress. The amount of redundancy that was applied to the strength and safety of the monorail beamway is the reason why they have never needed to replace a single beam span since 1959. And there's no need to fear the monorail falling off the beam itself because it straddles the sides of the beam, clamping down onto it like a vise. Ordinarily, on any straddle beam monorail design, 6 guide wheels are attached to the drive tires in a wheel arrangement called a bogie. However, the Disneyland Monorail is different. There's basically no bogie. The 4 guide wheels are attached to the frame independently from the drive tires. When the guide wheels shift around a curve, this compresses a hydraulic line that then pushes the drive tires in the same direction. It's like the power steering on a city bus, except entirely analog. It's unlike any other municipal monorail system in the world, and I can only speculate this was done to save on limited space for other hardware. The current Disneyland and Walt Disney World monorails still use an improved version of this steering system today. Walt Disney owned the monorail system through his private company Retlaw Enterprises, but the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway was under contract to sponsor any rail-based attractions at Disneyland. This created a problem because Walt had an arrangement that the monorail system's name would include the ALWEG name, and Santa Fe didn't like that. To win them over, Walt promised that he would put the Santa Fe Railway logo on every car of the monorails. And so it was that the park attraction was owned by Walt Disney, sponsored by the Santa Fe Railway, and named the Disneyland ALWEG Monorail system. The Disneyland Monorail quickly became a park favorite and a curiosity for the Southern Californian locals. No one had seen anything like it outside of Europe, and that's part of what made Disneyland so unique. Walt had an innate sense for what people wanted, even before they knew it themselves. The money the ride generated in its first 3 years was enough to afford upgrades, the first being to the monorail barn, the storage area where the monorails were parked at night. The first monorail barn was simply a corrugated steel shed beyond the north berm of the park and was built in a spot that would later be the loading area for It's a Small World. They built a larger barn further north, and it featured room for 3 new monorails. The next upgrade came to the trains themselves. The Mark I monorails, red and blue, were given upgraded hardware and an additional passenger car, making them a 4-car monorail with glass windows as opposed to the open-air cars they used to have. Then, Imagineering finished the project by building the 3rd train, which was painted yellow. While the original Mark I system made history as the first daily operating system in the Western Hemisphere, the Mark II system, which was introduced in 1961, included an expansion to the route. Now the trains left the park and traveled across the Disneyland parking lot all the way to the Disneyland Hotel, picking up guests for a return trip back to Tomorrowland. Walt was proud to officially call it a mode of transit because with 2 stops on the line, it was now operating with its intended purpose. Because it had to stop at the Disneyland Hotel, that meant it had to cross West Street twice, making it the first monorail system to cross over a municipal roadway. And because it leaves Tomorrowland from the east, it had to travel parallel to Harbor Boulevard, making it the first monorail to travel adjacent to a major vehicle thoroughfare. The monorail now travels a 2.5-mile journey. It went from 104 beams to nearly 300, and the beams outside the park have a maximum span of 55 feet. Constructing monorail track is very expensive, so much so that in 1966, when the show building for Pirates of the Caribbean was being built, the ride building would have to be designed into a triangular shape to squeeze into the area, erecting the southern wall within 12 feet of the monorail beam. There was one major flaw with the Mark II monorails. While they were an upgraded version, they still had bugs they inherited from the Mark I design, and they broke down a lot. In 1962, a monorail tractor was custom built for performing operational tasks. By day it would tow stranded monorails even if the power to the track was out, because the tractor was built with a V12 diesel engine. But by night, the tractors would be used to inspect the beamway and make repairs. In 1966, the Disneyland Railroad needed a new roundhouse, a bigger one to house all 4 steam trains they had. And around that time, due to the frequency of monorail breakdowns and the increasing use of the tow tractor, it was decided the monorails would need a second tow tractor. But they didn't have the room for all of that at the current storage barn, so the budget for the new railroad roundhouse included money to build a large monorail barn on the second floor. And there would be 4 tracks, with one dedicated to storing both tow tractors. By the year 1969, the monorail system was upgraded again to the Mark III design. This time, entirely new monorails were built, 4 of them, each one with 5 cars, making the trains a total length of 137 feet long. This meant both monorail stations would need to be lengthened to fit the extra car along the platform. New traction motors on the Mark IIIs meant that the bus bar on the beam would need to increase its voltage from 300 volts DC to 600. The Mark III design was slightly more economical. Each bogie had 1 large drive tire instead of 2 narrow tires. The 4th monorail would need to be parked with the others in the roundhouse, which meant that the 2 tractors would have to be shuffled around every morning so they could get 3 monorails out for the day. The 4 Mark III monorails they owned were red, blue, yellow, and green. The Mark III monorails were a successful design, and with the top-notch maintenance they received, they ran at 96% efficiency, meaning that they almost never broke down, even until 1987 when they were finally retired. But that wasn't the last time we would see the Mark III. For Disneyland's 35th anniversary in the year 1990, the front and rear nose cones of the Mark III Monorail Red were fused together and installed on the chassis of a stretched pickup truck in order to become the Mouso-Rail. The Mouso-Rail was made into a roadworthy float designed for the annual Tournament of Roses parade. And once finished with its run on the parade, it was then sent around the country to promote Disneyland's 35th anniversary. The last we ever saw of the Mouso-Rail was when it was repainted in neon colors and placed into the queue of Tomorrowland's Rocket Rods attraction. You'd think the next Disneyland monorail design would be the Mark IV, and you'd be right, but the Mark IV monorails were never built for Disneyland. Instead, they were built for the Walt Disney World monorail system back in 1971. So when Disneyland updated its system yet again, it was in the form of the Mark V. The Mark V monorails were introduced to the system by the year 1987. They weren't exactly new monorails. Instead, the Mark III monorails were shipped out one by one to be stripped down to the chassis and re-engineered. The old Mark III monorail cabins had a steel body, but the Mark V's had a new lightweight body made of aluminum. Most of the parts from the previous design were reused in order to save on cost, but you wouldn't know it because when the Mark V monorails began appearing at the park, they had new nose cones and cockpit controls, as well as the fact that the design was intended to emulate the modern Learjet, which was seen as sleek and futuristic. One last feature of the Mark V's was that they included ventilation ducts in each car. A squirrel cage fan located on both ends of the car drew air from the outside and pumped it into the cabin to keep guests cool. Each train had a cabin capable of seating 24 passengers, and if you include seating in the nose cones, then the total capacity of the monorail was 132. When the Mark V's were introduced, people noticed that instead of seeing Monorail Yellow come back, it was instead redone into Monorail Purple. The Mark V's had a long lifespan at Disneyland. They started getting phased out in 2007, which was exactly 20 years after they first debuted. Because of the success of the design, it was decided the Mark 7 monorails would be a simple redesign of the Mark V's. Keep in mind, the chassis of the Mark 7 dates back to 1969. They reused the Mark V bodies and remade the cabin interiors to have island bench seating and introduced LED lighting into the monorail. The new seating meant that each cabin holds only 22 passengers at maximum. If you include seating in the nose cones, then the total capacity of the train is 122 passengers, exactly 10 fewer people than the previous design. But I must note, the bench seating arrangement was more versatile with guests of different sizes, and it allowed room for the monorail cabins to fit folded strollers. The nose cones of the Mark 7s were designed to be reminiscent of the Mark 1 monorails. The interesting thing is that these nose cones were slightly longer and rounded corners differently than the Mark 5. Monorail Red was actually the first Mark 7 monorail introduced at Disneyland in 2007, but when it pulled into Tomorrowland Station during testing, the left side of the cockpit nose cone scraped against the corner of the platform, due in part to the slight turn just before the station. Imagineers immediately brought workers out to cut off part of the platform corner. It was a cheaper option than redesigning the nose cone. Monorail Purple never returned to the park after the upgrades. Disney had decided to cut maintenance costs by taking the fourth monorail out of the operation. With only 3 trains, the tow tractors wouldn't have to shuffle around every morning. The Mark 7 monorails originally had air conditioning. Small AC units were fitted above the drive tires to supply the cabins with cool air during the hot summers. They worked wonderfully for about 2 years, but because the AC units were originally designed for compact cars, they were constantly running beyond capacity, and the cost of maintaining them led the park to decide to stop fixing them. Instead, the windows of the cabin would be left open. Most of the air conditioners were replaced with squirrel cage fans, just like on the Mark V's, which helped keep the cabins ventilated. Interestingly, since the nose cones of the trains have no open windows, the crews have to keep the air conditioners in working order. To this day, the nose cones are the only place on the monorail with cool air always blowing. In the year 2009, 2 monorails at Walt Disney World in Florida collided, resulting in the death of a monorail pilot. To prevent this from ever happening at Disneyland in California, it was decided to permanently cease the 3 train operations. Now, only 2 monorails are allowed on the main line at once. This definitely affected the efficiency of the monorail system, and due to the way the trains were dispatched at Disneyland, it's highly unlikely that such a tragedy could have ever happened at the California resort. Nevertheless, the company didn't want to take the risk. The iridescent metallic paint job on the Mark 7s was quite expensive and delicate, but Disney managed to wrap the monorails with temporary decoration several times over the years. It wasn't until the crews were removing the Pixar Fest wraps back in 2018 that the paint started coming off upon removing the wraps. The damage wasn't terrible, but it was definitely noticeable enough that it was considered bad show quality. So it was decided to put the Pixar Fest wraps back on and wait until the next promotion to change them out. The damaged paint job of the monorails has been disguised by vinyl wraps continuously since 2018. Since the monorail opened in 1959, it has only been realigned in 3 places. The first was near the approach from Matterhorn to the Tomorrowland Monorail Station. The second time was the expansion of the track to the Disneyland Hotel, and the final realignment was in 1994 for the construction of the show building for Indiana Jones Adventure. They didn't have to realign the track at all for the construction of Disney's California Adventure. They simply constructed the new park around the existing track. Though the monorail's route was never moved away from Disneyland Hotel, it was the Disneyland Hotel that moved away from the monorail track, as its sprawling layout was consolidated into 3 high-rise towers, now 4 towers. The last remnants of the original buildings of the hotel were destroyed in 1999 to make way for downtown Disney. A year after the Disneyland Monorail became the first to cross a city street, the Seattle Monorail was constructed for the 1962 Century 21 Exposition, which was also known as the Seattle World's Fair. Their monorail traveled several city blocks, taking people to and from the Space Needle. The Seattle Monorail was constructed by ALWEG, and they went on to get other contracts for building monorail systems, but after much financial difficulty, the company was taken over by a third party in 1964. Despite this, the ALWEG name wasn't removed from the Disneyland Monorail until the year 1970. Seattle's ALWEG Monorail continues to provide service to and from the Space Needle, a last remnant of the optimistic future that was once predicted. Walt Disney fully believed that monorails have their place in society. Monorails weren't designed to replace passenger trains or buses. Instead, think of them as a replacement for light rail trams in areas where the terrain or rapid elevation changes make light rail prohibitive. Even the elevated concrete viaducts that light rail travels on choke out daylight in narrow corridors and block views of scenery. Monorail beams are sleeker and more aesthetically pleasing in these instances, and they require a lot less concrete and steel to construct. Walt had planned to construct Disney World with a monorail system that interconnected the various sub-districts within it, and he would have pioneered the use of people movers to carry riders away from the stations. Walt even supported ALWEG's attempt to build monorails in Los Angeles. He even tried to negotiate the construction of a monorail from downtown LA to Disneyland along the I-5 Center median. However, this was Southern California of the 1960s, and the car culture won out. The Disneyland Monorail system is on the Historical Engineering Landmarks list of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, otherwise known as ASME. That being said, this is not a federal designation, and therefore the Disneyland Monorail is not protected from future alterations in any way. However, it's safe to say we will probably never lose our beloved monorail. And for those who wonder about the top speed of the current monorail, they are capable of speeding along at 75 miles per hour. However, the trains are restricted to a maximum speed of 35 miles per hour on resort property. The Disneyland Monorail is a wonderful sight to behold. Most people have never seen a monorail with their own eyes, and the Disneyland Monorail is quite often the first one they've ever experienced. It was an ambition that had always been intended for the park, and a dream that finally came to fruition thanks to the collaboration of Walt's Imagineers. Visitors can still share in the delight of riding aboard Walt Disney's Highway in the Sky.